And we are officially recording. Welcome everybody to this joint project between Jewish National Fund and Alexander Muss High School in Israel. Today we have the pleasure learning from Lisa Biton, who was born and raised in Northern California. Lisa holds a BA in Classical Studies and European History from Santa Clara University and a Master's in Teaching from USC. Lisa studied abroad at Ben-Gurion University in Beersheba in 2005 and fell in love with the land of Israel and her Israeli husband. She made Aliyah in 2009 to the southern city of Kiryat Gat. Lisa has worked for Alexander Muss High School in Israel since 2010 as both a general studies teacher and an Israel studies teacher, and at both the Hod HaSharon campus and the Eshel HaNasi campus. Lisa and her husband have 3 children, and they love living in the Negev. Lisa Biton, it is a pleasure and an honor to be with you and everybody this afternoon. Thank you very much. It's all yours.
Thanks. Hi, everybody. It's good to see a lot of alumni, a lot of new faces and old faces. Today, our subject is George Washington and David Ben-Gurion as founding fathers. All of my students know that I have a thing that I call historical crushes, where I have historical figures who I love talking about, and George Washington happens to be one of them. I started out teaching in U.S. history, and so when I started doing the Israel studies here in Israel, I found a lot of similarities between Ben-Gurion and Washington and really wanted to explore how these people affected the founding of the state of Israel. So that's what we're going to be looking at today. So on the next slide, we have kind of our overarching questions for the day. Maybe. There we go. So if you have in the chat box, or if you want to unmute yourself one by one, to start off, what makes a good leader? When we're talking about good prime ministers, good presidents, what are we looking for? What should a good leader have to rule a country? We're in a time of chaos right now. What are you looking for in a leader to lead you through these times of chaos? Anyone want to or chat something?
By the way, you also have the ability to raise your hand or put a thumbs up down at the, there's an icon down at the bottom, but feel free to use the chat as well.
Okay, someone who listens to the people. Always listen to the people, or sometimes? Okay, someone who's well-spoken.
Consideration.
Takes consideration. Okay, make tough decisions, make decisions for the people. Okay, so on the one hand, we're listening to the people, but also making decisions for them. We can take initiative. Okay, so these are some good things, right? Someone who's well-spoken, trustworthy, someone who can figure out the group's needs over the individual. And this can be a hard line to draw, right? And so the second question I often ponder when it comes to these leaders is, why are people famous? Maybe that's a silly question. What made Washington a good leader? What made him make history? Or was it the fact that he was simply lucky in his time and he had the characteristics and the personality and the knowledge that was needed for these things, right? Which comes first in these situations. So we're going to kind of look at that, and I think we'll answer that one at the end. So if anyone hasn't taken a basic American history class or a basic Israeli history class, I thought I'd kind of just briefly give their biographies, and then we can talk a little bit about what makes them similar and what makes them different.
Wait, Lisa, we lost you for a second. Wait, we have some technical difficulties. Lisa, can you hear us?
And he was born into a farming, is it better now?
It's better now, yes.
Okay, sorry.
That's okay.
So he's born to a farming family, and he was well off, but not wealthy. And George Washington was a go-getter from the start. He wanted to be wealthy. He wanted to have a place in society. And for someone who wasn't in the upper levels, that was a really hard thing to do. And so he kind of took a hint from Muhammad, if anyone remembers. He married a wealthy widow, right? Someone who had money, someone who had connections, who had land. And he got lucky in a way in the fact that his half-brother passed away and left him a lot of land. He joined the military. That's another way to get up in the world. And we'll talk more about how he gets the presidency, but he becomes president at the age of 57. So that's kind of short of George Washington. As far as Ben-Gurion, he was born in Russia, or what was then Russia. He went to a Hebrew school from a young age. He was a Zionist in a Zionistic family, and he also became a socialist at a relatively young age. He made Aliyah in 1906 when he was still relatively young, and he wanted to work the land. He wanted to be a part of the community, and he wasn't great at it. If anyone watched Jacob yesterday, that he talked a little bit about that. When World War I broke out, he was kicked out of this area and sent to New York. He ran to New York and then came back to Israel at the end of World War I. And he became a politician, right? He only wanted to help the country, and he couldn't figure out a way to do it. He wasn't great in physically in the military. He wasn't great in agriculture, but he was a great politician. And so he will he will be 62 by the time he becomes prime minister, and we'll look a little bit about that later. So that's kind of brief overview. So I wanted to kind of look at some things that make them similar and different, and let's see how we feel about these two leaders. Yeah, we'll talk about the physical in a minute. So military leadership. Both Ben-Gurion and Washington knew that the military was the backbone of founding their country. I mean, think about it. They both were facing a military, the British military, that was much larger, much better organized, was clearly the winning side in any of this. And then, of course, Ben-Gurion later facing all the Arab countries who were, again, much larger, in theory, much better military than this, founding Jewish state. But both of them knew that they had to put together a strong military and a military face. Okay, so I have two quotes here. I'm actually going to start with the bottom one with George Washington. A free people ought not to be only be armed, but disciplined, to which end a uniform and a well-digested plan is requisite, and their safety and interest require they should promote such manufactories as tend to render them independent of others for essential, particularly military supplies. So I find this quote very George Washington. He was all about image, right? He had very little formal education, but he had served in the French Indian War. He had almost been shot through the clothes 4 times. He had this image. He'd written a book about his military time, and he wanted to be seen as this military leader, even though he'd lost in his military career more battles than he ever won by far. When it comes to the Continental Congress and, they're picking leaders, he shows up in full battle uniform, even though it's 20 years after he's retired from the army, right? Again, as Judy was saying, right? He was tall. He was 6'3", which was super tall at the time. He was a redhead. He was very striking. And he wanted to look this military personality. And as military leader, he wanted to be in command. He wanted to make sure that people listened to him. He wanted to surround himself by the right people, but also know that he had the end, right? So for instance, he hires Henry Knox, right, to be in his cabinet to help lead his military. On the other hand, Charles Lee, anyone who's been listening to Hamilton recently, Charles Lee, who is one of his commanders, crosses him in the Battle of Monmouth, and Washington basically ruins his whole life, his whole career, kicks him out of everything. So Washington's trying to balance this, on the one hand, listen to people who know what's going on the other hand, make sure that everyone's listening to him as ultimate leader. And Ben-Gurion had even more of that, I think. So here he says, a Jewish state also means Jewish security. Here one sees to our security with our own strength and our own means. Ben-Gurion wasn't like Washington. He had some military background, but not in the kind of leadership that Washington did. But he was an avid leader and a reader. And when he was put in charge of the army in the War of Independence, the first thing he did was read and lock himself in his room and ask people on how to lead. And they both knew that they couldn't win the war by themselves. They had to surround themselves with the right people and the right leaders. And so, I think this is a real similarity between them, that they both wanted this image. Ben-Gurion also often showed up in his khaki uniform, right? Again, this image of war. If we see paintings of him later, with the Israeli flag in the background and this nice military uniform. So they both knew that the military was a way to cement their leadership, but also a way to push, their image forward as a strong leader. Because I think what a lot of people like, we think about leaders, we look at, Netanyahus and in Israel, for instance, now, or a lot of American presidents, though not our current president, having this military background, this military image gives people a sense of confidence, gives, the people who they're under, especially, in times of chaos. So that was one. In the next slide, there is an image here. We have George Washington in his uniform, right? This is in the age of 40, and Ben-Gurion in his Jewish Legion uniform at 32. Just, again, the image they're presenting to the world, different, but the same military image. Okay, we can go to the next one. So as Judy was saying before, one of the most important things is the public image. Washington was obsessed with his public image. He wanted nothing but to be admired and to be talked well about, but also understood, as a regal leader. He believed that leaders should have a certain dress. They should be fancy, but not too much. Someone asked, Jackson asked on the side, they're not English letters, but this is from, they're English letters, but it's not English. This is from a election that Ben-Gurion did for the Histadrut, which I'll get to in 1 second. So Washington, again, as I said, he was 6'3", but he often lied about his height, told people he was only 6 foot because he thought that saying 6'3" was, over exaggerated, would seem too cocky of himself. He quoted Cato all the time. He wanted to talk about, himself as a worker of the state, as patriotic. He never had children, which actually was one of the reasons why they chose him for president, because they were worried for this dynasty, right? One thing the Americans didn't want was a king. And so someone who didn't have kids and who probably couldn't have kids was, a good image to have. He when they offered him the position of president, he refused to pay for it. And basically, when they write in the Constitution, they said, look, we have to pay the president. If we don't pay the president, then that means the president can only be someone who's wealthy, and we don't want that. And Washington said, I agree with that, but I don't want the money. All I want is that you pay for my travel expenses, for a horse and cart, basically. But I want to be a servant of the state. I don't think I should get the money. So he was all about his image, but he was also very private. So at his death, all of his personal letters were destroyed by his wife. He didn't want any of his emotion to be shown. I once read a article that talked about what George Washington would be like on a blind date. And it said, on the one hand, he would probably, and I love this question, on the one hand, he would probably be really charming and, have all the right things to say and all the nice clothes. On the other hand, he had a temper and he had very strong emotions. So he didn't want any of that seen in the public eye after he died, which is why he, had everything destroyed. Ben-Gurion, on the other hand, was basically the exact opposite. He was also a prolific writer, but he never made any attempt to hide his, feelings, his reactions, his diaries out there for everyone to see. And he believed that the people needed what he could give them. Someone said before, we were talking about, is it knowing what the people need, or is it listening to the people? And Ben-Gurion very much felt that he knew what the people needed. He wanted to listen to people, but also when it came down to it, there are situations we see in early Israel history, like one of the ones we talk about in class are the reparations from Germany, right? Where Ben-Gurion, where Israel's basically offered from Germany money, after the Holocaust, and people don't want to take it. It's blood money, right? But Ben-Gurion says, look, we can't survive without it. And this is what the people need to have, whether or not they know to want it. Same thing with accepting the partition plan, right? People may say that's not the right way to go, but no, we need a state, and this is the way we're going to get a state. And he never hesitated to say those things, to follow the direct line. And that was very much his image, right? He wanted this image as the hard line, always following what he believed in, never questioning. And so they're two different leaders in that kind of way, where Washington really wanted this clear public image and listening to the people. We'll talk about the Constitution in a second. And Ben-Gurion thought a lot of times he knew better than everybody else. But he knew what had to be done, for good or for bad. Which leads us into the Constitution. there's been a lot of talk about Constitution recently. Jacob also talked about this in the class yesterday. Washington loved the idea of a Constitution, right? He said, we need to get the rules down on paper. We have had decades of unrest in America and in the colonies. We need to step forward, and the only way to step forward is to get it on paper and then work with the practicality of what that looks like in law. If we're going to secure the rights of individuals, we need to put them on paper, because that's exactly what we're missing with Britain. And once Washington supported the Constitution, basically all the anti-federalists, all the people who didn't want a constitution, they had no support for themselves. And that's why we have a constitution in America, although we have a Bill of Rights also. Ben-Gurion, on the other hand, was completely against a constitution. He thought basically we have, two Jews, three opinions, and if you get all these Jews in a room trying to write a constitution, it's never going to happen. And it's a waste of our time at the founding of the country. And if we are going to, focus on the important things, we have 100,000, 200,000, 300,000 immigrants coming in every year. We have to deal with those issues. We have to deal with the issues on the ground. We have Arab countries who are trying to kill us. We don't have time to deal with the Constitution. It's not that we don't have a democracy. We're going to work on the Constitution. We're going to create these laws. But if we're going to start arguing over the semantics of what it means to be a Jew and the semantics of what it means to be a Zionist and what this enterprise is and what the culture is, and we're never going to get into the practical, building of the country. And I think, again, that comes out a lot of, Ben-Gurion's history and where he comes, after the Holocaust and the urgency of it, which, Washington didn't have. And, this idea of a constitution we still don't have in Israel. And Jacob also mentioned this yesterday. I'll talk about political factions in a minute. Is that we have these two sides. We need a constitution. Is it important or not? I think most Americans, especially if we're taking an AP US history class, of course we need a constitution. That's the very basis of everything we believe in. That's what makes a democracy. Whereas Ben-Gurion would say, we live a democracy and our laws are democratic and we don't need a constitution to do that. Although people have been trying to write a constitution in Israel since the founding of the state. And so that's, a really big question, is how much do we need a constitution or not? One of the other things, Greg, still there? Next slide. Maybe. Okay. Is that both were dealing with this, Jake here was asking about the political factions and parties. George Washington really was aware of the split in his country, right? Citizens by birth or by choice of a common country. That country has the right to concentrate your affections. The name of American, which belongs to you, must always exalt the pride of patriotism, right? It doesn't matter who you are, if you're from Virginia or New York, if you, are a farmer or if you're a banker, it doesn't matter. You are an American, and that's what means the most important. And this is what, he spoke about in his farewell address, about not, dividing the country along lines. And Ben-Gurion felt the same way, not about, where you're, not about, the area of America you're from or what you do, but the same thing about these different Jews from France, from Russia. We're going to come from all over the world, and we have to figure out a way to be together, to unite ourselves under this new banner of a country and this challenge of how do we do that? How do we pass laws? Where do we put the capital, right? What language are we speaking? So these are all things that they both dealt with, in order to unite their people and how that should look. One of the most important things I find is about how they step down, is about the end of their rule. And this is what I always find most fascinating about George Washington is, if anyone, again, has watched Hamilton recently, Washington was very aware of his precedents, right? What am I doing and how is it affecting the future of this country? And he served 2 terms, right? 8 years. And everyone wanted him to run again. He was doing great. It was all good, right? The country was doing decently. The economics were doing decently. We're pulling ourselves up. But he was really worried, because what if he died in power? I mean, he's very conscious. He wasn't that young, for the time. And he was in his 60s, which was old then. So how do if I die in office, what happens? right? Will they know how to do a new election? Will they know what to do as vice president? And he didn't think they would. So he said, I need to step down so I can help everyone through this, right? So I can walk everyone through the process and figure out that everyone knows what it means to go through this party, which is kind of good he did. And so he steps down, and he only lives for about 2 years after he retires. And in those 2 years, about a year and a half, he goes back to Mount Vernon, his house, and about 700 people visit him in the year before he dies, right? People still see him as this great leader, as having the answers to all the problems that everyone needs. And he still put on this face of, service to his country. Greg, can you switch the slide? I think there's one more. No, down. Thanks. No, too fast. Is there not one more between this? Sorry, guys, technical issues. There we go. Okay. So this is part of George Washington's farewell address, right? Which again, you can hear if you've listened to Hamilton, that part is quoted. Still the other one, the stepping down one. Technical difficulties. So Ben-Gurion really wanted the process to work through itself. Ben-Gurion kind of felt similar. He served 5 years as prime minister, and then he said, okay, I need to step down. There was a lot of arguing going on in the parties. And he had found this little tiny group of people who were setting up a new settlement in Stable Care in the south, in the middle of nowhere. And he wanted to show the people, what it meant to be a true Israeli, which wasn't just politics. It was moving to the Negev. It was, raising sheep and building the Negev. And so he did. He moved out there, and there's all sorts of fun stories when he goes out there. They tell him, oh, we're going to build you a great big house. You're the prime minister. And he says, no, I just want to be like everybody else. And so they build him a double wide, right? He gets twice as much as everybody else. Still not a big fancy house. No Mount Vernon there. But he wants to be like everybody else. He works like everybody else. Even though he's older, he does what he can. And he sees the country through its process of election. Now, of course, he will return to government only 2 years later. And he will then serve again. He will serve for 13 years as prime minister. Now our second longest consecutive prime minister. Before he will finally retire, he retires for good in 1963. In the 6-Day War, he is actually approached by the government saying, come back and help us, right? We don't know how to win this war. We need a strong leader. And he says, no, you can do it. You Begin and Moshe Dayan, you can lead the war. You don't need me to lead it. And one of the things I find so interesting also is this end of Washington's speech and this quote from one of Ben-Gurion's writings. And so Ben-Gurion talks about, our mutual cares, labors, and dangers, all these great things that he has built as a country and that the people have worked for. And then Ben-Gurion's quote here. Why does the Jew have an affinity for Israel? Because here again, everything remains to be accomplished. It's his privilege and his place to share in this creative act. The trees of Stable Care speak to me in a special way, in a different language than any other trees anywhere. Not only because I helped to grow them, but because they constitute a gift of man to nature, a gift of the Jews to the cradle of their culture. So Ben-Gurion felt these trees in the Negev, which you've ever been to, is beautiful, but isn't, any kind of Switzerland or, beautiful Alps. But because they took effort, because the people worked on them with their hands, because the Jews have, put so much effort into building this country of their own and everything it means, the culture, the agriculture, the high tech now, everything that people have done, it's so much more important. We connect to it so much more, and it makes it so much better than anything else. And George Washington felt that too, right? The very building of this country, this act that we have as Americans to build this democracy and to build this new nation and to have representation, it just makes it better than everything else when we have these hands in things. And so I find that like a really interesting comparison between the two. George Washington will die only about a year and a half after he retires. He's 67, and he's buried at Mount Vernon with his family. Ben-Gurion will die at 87, about 10 years after retirement, and he's buried in the last picture at Stable Care, which we take our students to. And Stable Care holds kind of a personal thing for me. When I was in Israel studying abroad 15 years ago now at Ben-Gurion, I had a really hard, first couple weeks. It was during the Intifada. Things were blowing up. And we ended a hike here. And this was the first moment looking out at this view from Ben-Gurion's grave was the first time I ever felt, at home, comfortable. And so some people say that Ben-Gurion chose to be buried out here to bring people here, right? To bring people to the Negev, to make it a tourist spot, to show people, the beauty of what could be. Most Israeli leaders are buried at Mount Herzl at our military cemetery. Other people say that Ben-Gurion chose to be buried here because he didn't want to be in the shadow of Herzl and Jabotinsky and other leaders, right? He wanted his, his own name, his own special space. George Washington, of course, didn't have, there was no Arlington Cemetery then. So, being buried in his family plot was kind of the most logical step. So, these are some of the similarities and difficulties, the differences. I know that was kind of like a lot in a short amount of time. But what do you guys think? Was George Washington a better leader? Was it because of his time? He just knew what the people needed? Was Ben-Gurion a better leader? Or do we not know yet because we're too close in history? We don't understand, the impact of what Ben-Gurion has done. A lot of discussion going on now is the fact that there is no term limit on prime ministers in Israel like there is in the States, right? Washington basically set that precedence, although it wasn't law until after FDR. That was, the rule, the unspoken rule, whereas here now we have prime ministers who sit for decades. And some people say that's a good thing because they're leading well. And other people say, no, that's simply a sign of too much control and a lack of democracy. So what do you guys think? Is there a right way, wrong way? Who's the better leader? If you want to open up to talk, if you want to write something.
So everybody's able to unmute themselves. I ask that we do it judiciously and, of course, using the chats. I see a couple of folks have raised their hands. So let me see if I can find who raised their hands. It doesn't tell me. So Natalie Westrick raised her hand, and so did Robert Kutner. So I'll call on Natalie, then Robert, and then Lisa, we can turn to the chat as well.
Hi, I just want to say this is really cool and I really appreciate it. I also wanted to say that, I think the start of the United States and the beginning of the state of Israel were very, very different. And so it's kind of hard to judge, who was the better leader, not just because we're so close in time to Ben-Gurion, but also because the start of each countries was so different. And I think it's hard to make that comparison because you have a start of a country based off of the hatred of their mother country and mercantilism and England, and we don't want another King George. And then we have the long history of Zionism and the kind of the ideology of starting these two countries was completely different.
Good points. Maybe they just need different leaders. So maybe you're saying it's the history that affects it. Depends on what we need and who's a better leader in that time.
Yeah.
Robert, go ahead.
So a lot of what I was going to say was just said, but I think that a crucial difference is the people that we have, is what bound together Americans versus what bound together Israelis in the early days. I do agree. I think it's a very apples and oranges thing. That having been said, I certainly think that Ben-Gurion comes off a little better, but that's really a your mileage may vary thing.
Okay. That's true. I happen to like George Washington better, but that's my own personal what a leader should be. But I agree that the situations are very different. Just to read some of the things in the chat, I think we're still close to really no. I think they're very different leaders. Term limits. Ava, you want to talk about term limits at all? No. Ben-Gurion. Jake, why do you say Ben-Gurion was better? Something specific?
May I say something about term limits?
Yes.
I think that I noticed in the chat somebody said that leaders all have different personalities and approach leadership very differently. And I think that we benefit from that kind of plurality, and we never see that if we don't have term limits.
That's definitely a good point. Right now, we've been under the same leader for a very long time, and there's some question as to if that's a good thing or a bad thing. It also leads to stability, which can be good, right? We were talking about the next presidential elections in the US and the fact that it is really hard to unsit a sitting president because people like what they know. You know, it's better than the unknown. Even if you don't like what there is, the unknown could be worse. And it's kind of human nature to, you know, want to stay with the same thing. So maybe term limits shake that up a bit, right? And force us to go through that process. I think it might be too close in time to tell. Kyra saying, again, the difference that people were under monarchy, but versus the Jews coming to Israel who had already experienced different forms of government. Both were good for their times. The spotlight loved both of them. Ben-Gurion is smart and well-read and understood that power. Are you sure the spotlight loved both of them, or they both loved the spotlight? Or both? I think it is very clear. I think, you know, we're talking about yesterday also, is that both Washington and Ben-Gurion sought out the public eye, right? They wanted to have this image. They wanted to be in control. Maybe they never imagined themselves to be, you know, the greatest leader, but that's, you know, getting better every time and being a better leader and having more power was definitely clear for both of them. So, you know, it wasn't by accident that this kind of stuff happened, that they both ended up in positions of power. Jonah saying it was very beneficial that Ben-Gurion, Penny G, lived with people in the kibbutz and lived like a normal citizen, understanding what they needed, a sense of pride. They both needed visibility to advance the causes, right? Although, you know, Washington always wrote that one of the biggest things he was upset about was that he never could free the slaves, right? He, you know, even he understood that through democracy, there's only so much push he could give about his own personal belief, right? He didn't think there should be, although he had slaves himself, right? There's a complicated story with his own slavery. But he understood that, you know, there's only so much he could advance in what he believed in. And like Ben-Gurion said with the Constitution, right? There's, you know, a limit to how much we can do at the beginning. So we have to focus on that. Jackson saying, I think Ben-Gurion had more factions to unite and probably a harder job doing so. Maybe. The U.S. wasn't the most united area at the beginning, especially what it means to be a government. But maybe it was clear, you know, split, maybe. I can't see hands, I don't think, can I? If anybody else.
Yeah, I'm getting, if people can still raise their hands, I get the notifications, but feel free to use also the chat as well, or raise your hand and we can call on you one at a time.
Okay. I know, you know, I don't know that there is a right or wrong answer into who is a better leader. You know, a lot does depend on the time and what is needed. I always find this question of, you know, does a leader need to know what's right for the people, or how much should they listen to the people, a fascinating one. And Ben-Gurion definitely thought one way, Washington was a little more in the middle. But what do you guys think? Should a leader listen to the people, or was Ben-Gurion right that a leader should know better sometimes than the people? And that be the end. Like right now with, you know, our current situation in Israel today, for those of you who've been paying attention, Israel just made stricter rules. And so we are now basically not allowed to leave our houses unless it's for an emergency. So, you know, should the leader be making decisions, or should the leader be listening to what the people are saying? The runners and my co-teachers have been arguing that runners shouldn't count because we run by ourselves and leave us alone and we are not spreading corona anywhere. but our prime minister has decided that's not the case, right? So is that something that he should be listening to, or does he know the bigger situation and therefore, the end? Okay, some people in the box here are saying a leader should always be willing to listen but not necessarily act. Leaders lead, sometimes they need to make decisions. It's a careful balance. Sure, the average person on the street doesn't have the full picture. Sometimes leaders know more. I always wonder how much we know as citizens versus the leaders, and that kind of always scares me. What does everybody else know that we don't? What do our leaders know that we don't? The reason they're leaders to make the decisions. They're chosen to represent the people, so it has to balance. Someone asked about how about us leaving. You can leave to get food. You can go grocery shopping, and that's about it at the moment. Or to work if you are a healthcare provider. Depends on the situation. They should listen and be empathetic. Is it about how they present it? Is that part of the issue? It's not about if they're making decisions for us, but about whether we feel like they're listening to us or not, even if they are or not. It's a tough call because leaders have access to classified information. Maybe public opinion be different, more info. There's a certain amount of trusting our gut that we all have to do, right? How much do the people need to know, or should they know? Would anyone like to talk? I feel like I'm hearing my voice a lot. There's some good stuff going on in the chat, but I'd love to hear.
I see some hands being raised, and unfortunately, it doesn't show me who they are. So feel free to chat out, I raised my hand, or keep using the raise hand icon, or judiciously unmute yourself.
Okay, Jackson, go ahead. And then Rob.
Sorry, I have to scroll up really quickly to just find my comment. Basically, one of what I was thinking is that there's a certain point at which we elect a leader because we think they have the skills necessary to lead a country. So to a certain extent, I would expect a leader to know better than the average man on the street how to handle any given situation. With that said, somebody mentioned that maybe public opinion would change with more information. Also true, but I also think that to a certain extent, a leader should be the default, right? That we should default, or a leader should say, I know what I'm doing, but the people shouldn't necessarily default to that leader. What I mean by that is, a leader can say, this is what I think we should do based on the information and the background and the knowledge and the skills that I have. But before that thing is done, the people shouldn't take it blindly. They should ask for proof or knowledge or background as to how that leader made that decision in order to trust that he is in fact making the decision that's best for the country. So while we should expect a leader to know better, we should never default to assuming they do.
And I always find that challenging, right? How do we know? There's a lot going on with Netanyahu right now, and his legal situation, and should he be able to run for prime minister or not? And how much is his court case has now been pushed off months because of all this. I'm not saying it's connected, but at what point should we be listening to what he's saying, and at what point should we be looking for ulterior motives and personal messages? And I think that's a really challenging line to walk as a citizen, right? Washington said when he's in the Constitutional Congress that it's our right to rebel when we don't have a voice. It's our right to speak out against the British and to raise an army against them because they're not doing what the people want, right? But at what point do the people not know? And at what point do we have the social contract where we agree the government knows better than us and we give up issues for that?
Well, and what you said about,
sorry.
What you said about Ben-Gurion makes a lot of sense too. Or not Ben-Gurion, sorry, about Bibi. Right, that we don't know how things would be different if this trial had gone on as scheduled. But for the time being, unfortunately or fortunately, depending on who you are, he's still leader, and we have to assume that he knows best. But given where we stand with him, in that we're waiting for a corruption trial and all of that, I think it's fair for the people to stand up and say, any decision you make, we would like to hear the rationale for it so that we can decide whether you are in fact acting in our best interests as we assume you are.
Right. That's what happened with the Speaker of the Knesset today, right? Who stepped down because he tried to go against what the Supreme Court said he had to.
So we have a few folks who've raised their hands, and I just want to make sure we
Yeah,
get.
sorry,
We've got.
Rob,
That's okay. We've got Robert Kutner again. So Robert, go ahead and unmute yourself.
So it's not very satisfying, but I think that a lot of this can only be established in retrospect. Frequently, it's so we have an idea of individual decisions, and at the time, we look at it in terms of individual decisions. But the question of whether it's better to be guided by the people or be guided by the leader is, there's no one answer for it, and frequently it's only the judgment of history that ends up putting that into any way that any easily digestible manner.
So our grandkids will tell us.
Well, our grandkids will tell us that we're wrong, but that's how grandkids do.
Oh, we got an agreement there. Okay. Did anyone else have a hand up? They wanted to add something? Or just unmute yourself and say something? Okay. Look, one of the reasons why I bring this up with my students when we have these conversations, I bring them out to Stapel Care, to the grave, and talk about this, is because exactly what a bunch of you were saying is that this isn't something that's stuck in the past, right? A lot of what we do at HSI is bringing the past alive, and this is an ongoing debate. How much can we trust our leaders? How much are myths built up around our leaders, right? Of course, George Washington, things like chopping down the tree and the wooden teeth. He has all these sort of myths built up around him that make him this hero of history. And Ben-Gurion himself, right? This leader of the state, the man who himself founded the state. And the leaders we have today, I think it's easily argued that Bibi has been building up his own myth, right? Even as he's been leader and alive, and Trump, of course, has his own, I don't know if I want to call it myth, but his own image, right? That he is portraying. And these are our leaders of our time, and we need to decide, what do we want from these leaders? What do we expect of them in these situations? We're going through a really difficult crisis right now around the world. And you can see that different leaders are reacting in very different ways. And we can agree with them or disagree with them, but as citizens of these states, how do we react, right? There have been Americans who have come back to Israel because Israel is safer and has, socialized healthcare and whatever. And I have friends in Israel who have gone back to America because there's more space and there's Amazon, and, if things are going to go to hell, then we might as well have Amazon Prime. Although I heard that's not a thing anymore, maybe. I heard they were taking it away recently. And so, what do we want from our leaders and what do we expect from them? And, those of you who are still students, it's not going to be that long before you can vote. And those of us who can vote, we have a say in this. Kyra says, interesting, because watching sorry, I got cut off. Eisenhower speech the other day, and the image leadership used to portray so different, right? Social media is a big thing, right? How do leaders portray this?
Lisa, I think your audio cut out on us. Lisa, your audio cut out on us.
Okay, sorry, back now?
Oh, you're back. You're back.
Okay. And so what do these leaders choose to do, and how do they choose to represent themselves? I was having this argument with a class a couple weeks ago before they left, with a Milken class from Los Angeles. And, the FDR idea that you never see FDR in a wheelchair. And would the media do the same thing to a president or a prime minister today, right? How does the media agree or disagree with our leaders, and how do they use that? That's a whole other conversation. But it is, important to think about also is how much are we getting from the media about the image of our leaders and versus what they're actually doing, right? With Bibi Netanyahu, that's the big debate now about his racism, right? He portrays himself as kind of this like big racist, but in actuality, if we look at the numbers on the ground, he has improved the life of Arabs, in the last since he's been leader, last 10 years specifically. And so again, what's this media versus reality is a really challenging thing to face in our world. We look at the virus, right? What's actually happening versus, what the media is. It's hard to see. Rob, you're right. Exactly. When Dick Cheney was in a wheelchair, or any of our leaders, they like showing the weaknesses.
Lisa, Annette Gleiberman raised her hand. I apologize for butchering your last name.
Go ahead.
No problem. I also think it's interesting because we also see a lot more of our leaders' lives now with social media. Things aren't, Washington doesn't say something you read in a paper a week later. We know instantly with social media what's happening, and we know what's happening all the time. We have access to Trump's Twitter account, which can be a good or bad thing, depending on who you are, but that's there. We hear so much more from our leaders now than ever before, and we know so much more about their lives. So I think that also changes about how we view different leaders. Some of our leaders in history, we don't really know that much about them compared to now with like a constant stream of information that we know about every leader thanks to social media.
It's very true, right?
And
what do you
outlets
catch them?
and everything.
Yeah, where do you catch them? What awkward pictures can you find? Although I personally feel that Washington would probably be more like an Obama than a Trump when it came to social media, right? Using it, in certain ways. Anybody else like to say anything? Anyone else have a hand up? No. Okay. I hope you guys enjoyed your time here. There's still. Sorry, I went too fast. It's interesting about the duality now in society. We want to accept everyone as they are, whether they're weight, gender, religion, blah, blah. At the same time, every single candidate in the U.S. has been accused of having health issues and a weapon. We, on the one hand, we say, especially in America, we don't say it so much in Israel, but in America, we like everybody. We're open to everybody. We can't judge, and then we judge a lot all the time, which... I always found we were talking, I was leading an AP Gov class this last unit, and we were talking about the Democratic primaries, right, and what's being thrown at these people. Although I found it interesting that Buttigieg, who was in the primaries and is now not, no one really discussed the gay thing, which I thought was interesting. So, is that a step up? The male-female divide was definitely there. The age thing, basically most people on the stage being over the age of 70 was a big issue. And so it's interesting what we pick out and what we don't, and what seems to bother society or not. In Israel, we seem to have less of that. I'm not really sure why. If Israelis are just kind of like, well, leaders are leaders, and as long as you're a good leader, it doesn't really matter, what you look like or, other issues you might have. Okay. So I hope everyone had fun, some food for thought. You're welcome to message me if you have any other questions or if you want to say anything else. And
Lisa, can you share, Lisa, in the chat, will you share your email quickly, please, for everybody?
Sure. Sorry. People message you privately and you can't send it to the public after that.
Click on everyone. You could, there you go.
Okay. There we go.
And as Lisa, sorry, Lisa, again.
Sorry, no, I was going to say that I have some amazing coworkers who are going to be doing other classes in the next couple weeks. And so please, tune into them also, and hope to hear from you guys.
Lisa, I want to say thank you. That was spectacular, learning about the juxtaposition between George Washington, David Ben-Gurion. I want to remind everybody to please email me at glitkovsky@amhsi.org to let us know that you were here. Lisa, we can share with you the PowerPoint. We can share with you other resources. Please let us know, even if you've been on previous calls. I want to say, I know there's a friendly competition going on. You were about the same as yes. No, I'm just kidding. We had close to 100 people again on this call. So please share the word with your friends. We'll be doing this every day with our amazing AMHSI teachers. Lisa, thank you so much for your incredible teaching. Thank you everybody for joining us. Be safe and be well. Thank you. Lisa, can you hang out for a minute? Lisa, we'll just wait till most everybody hops off and then we'll
No problem.
pick up. Everyone can just close the window and you'll end the session. I just can't end it for everybody because then you won't be able to join tomorrow.
Thanks, Lisa. Miss you.
Bye. Elad, I was just thinking about you. Do you know that they all ended up in isolation?
Yeah, they told me. Apparently there's a video of like really religious people outside blasting music, and the cops came and shut them down.
They were pretty funny. I talked to the grandmother, and she was like stressed. I'm stuck. Anyways, we're all okay. How's Arizona?
Boring. Really, really boring.
Sorry.
I bet.
Yeah.
All right.
Nothing new.
Thanks everybody. Again, you have to end the call yourself because if I kick you off, you won't be able to join back tomorrow. So just go ahead and close the window and we'll end the call for the day.
Just a quick hello, Lise.
All right, we still got a few folks hanging on. Okay, Lisa, how'd that go?
I mean, I'm very I get very,
Yep.
It's okay. The end was great. I thought it went really well, the second half.